The sledgehammer crashed through the concrete with a thunderous crack that echoed through the suburban morning. Sarah Chen wiped sweat from her brow, unaware that across the fence, Karen Whitmore was already dialing 911 with a twisted smile. "Officer, they're demolishing their pool at 6 a.m. with heavy machinery," she lied smoothly into the phone. But Karen had no idea that Sarah's husband was a retired police sergeant who still had friends on the force, friends who were about to uncover a web of false reports that would destroy more than just concrete. Sometimes the hammer of justice swings hardest on those who throw the first stone. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Oakwood Hills subdivision as Sarah Chen stood in her backyard, staring at the cracked concrete pool that had become her obsession. 3 months of planning, 2 weeks of permits, and 1 very expensive demolition crew, all leading to this moment. "You sure about this, honey?" David called from the sliding glass door, his coffee mug steaming in the cool October air. 27. Years as a police sergeant had taught him to question everything, even his wife's home improvement decisions. Sarah adjusted her work gloves and nodded toward the eyesore that had dominated their yard for 15 years. "Look at it, Dave. The line is shot, the pump's dead, and the deck is cracking. We are throwing good money after bad." The pool had been a dream when they'd bought the house, visions of summer barbecues and their daughter Emma learning to swim. But Emma was 22 now, living in Seattle, and the pool had become nothing more than a breeding ground for mosquitoes and neighborhood complaints. "Besides," Sarah added, glancing toward the white picket fence that separated their property from the Whitmores, "maybe we'll finally have some peace." David's jaw tightened. They both knew she meant Karen Whitmore, their neighbor of 8 years, who had turned property line disputes into an art form. The woman had filed complaints about everything from their sprinkler timer, too early, to their garbage cans, placed 6 inches over an imaginary line, to their dog, barking, though they didn't own a dog. The rumble of diesel engines announced the arrival of Chen Brothers Demolition. Sarah had chosen the family business specifically because they weren't related. She just appreciated the coincidence of the name. The foreman, a weathered man named Rico, climbed down from the lead truck. "Mrs. Chen, we are here for the pool demo." Rico consulted his clipboard. "Permits are all filed, utilities marked. We should have this knocked out by noon." "Perfect." Sarah shook his hand. "The sooner, the better." As Rico's crew began unloading equipment, Sarah noticed a curtain twitch in the Whitmore house. Karen's angular silhouette appeared briefly in the kitchen window before disappearing again. Sarah had learned to recognize the signs. Karen was preparing for battle. The first sledgehammer blow rang out at 7:15 a.m., a satisfying crack that sent vibrations through the ground. Sarah felt a rush of liberation as chunks of concrete tumbled into the shallow end. Each impact was like striking back at years of petty harassment, of anonymous complaints to the HOA, of passive-aggressive comments about property values. Rico's crew worked with practiced efficiency, their synchronized hammering creating a rhythm that seemed to pulse with Sarah's heartbeat. She was so absorbed in the destruction that she almost missed the police cruiser pulling into her driveway. Officer Martinez stepped out of the car, his expression apologetic. Sarah knew him from the neighborhood, a young patrolman who'd been on the force for maybe 3 years. Behind him, a second cruiser arrived, this one containing Officer Janet Torres, a stern woman with silver hair and 20 years of experience. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," Martinez called over the noise. "We've got a complaint about noise violations and unpermitted demolition work." Sarah's stomach dropped, but David appeared at her elbow before she could respond. His retired sergeant's presence immediately changed the dynamic. "Hey, Martinez. Janet." David's voice carried the easy authority of someone who'd spent decades in uniform. "What's the complaint?" Torres consulted her notepad. Anonymous caller reported heavy machinery operating at 6 a.m., possible code violations, and she paused, looking uncomfortable. Potential property damage to neighboring structures. 6 a.m. Sarah's voice pitched higher. "It's 7:15. The crew didn't even arrive until 7. Martinez shifted uncomfortably. The caller was pretty specific about the time, and said the noise woke up the whole neighborhood. David's eyes narrowed. In his years on the force, he'd developed a sixth sense for lies, and something about this complaint reeked of fabrication. Who made the call? "Anonymous tip line," Torres replied, but her expression suggested she was thinking the same thing. David was Rico approached the group, wiping his hands on a rag. "Officers, we've got all our permits right here." He handed over a folder of documents. "City inspection yesterday, utility clearance, noise ordinance compliance. We are allowed to start at 7 a.m. on weekdays." Torres reviewed the paperwork while Martinez examined the job site. Everything was clearly in order, but protocol demanded they investigate every complaint. The caller also mentioned that the work might damage the neighboring property. Torres said carefully, "Something about vibrations affecting the foundation next door." Sarah's gaze snapped to the Whitmore house, where she could see Karen's face pressed against the window. Their eyes met for a moment before Karen jerked the curtain closed. "That's interesting," David said slowly, "because the nearest structure is 30 feet away, and we are only breaking up the pool deck. No heavy machinery, no foundation work." A memory surfaced in Sarah's mind, Karen's complaints about their sprinkler system. The woman had claimed it was flooding her yard, but when Sarah checked, she discovered Karen had actually been overwatering her own garden and blaming the runoff on them. The pattern was becoming clear. "You know what, officers?" Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "I think we should look into who's been making these anonymous complaints. This isn't the first time we've had issues with false reports in this neighborhood." Torres and Martinez exchanged a look. In their experience, neighbors who made legitimate complaints usually weren't afraid to identify themselves. "We'll note that in our report," Torres said diplomatically. "In the meantime, you're clear to continue the work. Everything appears to be in order." As the officers prepared to leave, Martinez hesitated. "Mrs. Chen, you might want to keep a record of when work actually starts and stops. You know, in case there are more complaints." David nodded grimly. "Good advice. We'll definitely be documenting everything from now on." The police cruisers had barely pulled out of the driveway when Karen Whitmore emerged from her house, marching across her perfectly manicured lawn with the determined stride of someone convinced of their own righteousness. "Sarah." Karen's voice carried across the yard with the sharp edge of manufactured outrage. "This is completely unacceptable." Sarah steeled herself for the confrontation she'd been dreading. Karen was in her 50s, with platinum blonde hair, sprayed into submission and the lean build of someone who spent more time at hot yoga than was strictly necessary. Her homeowners association presidency had given her a taste for authority that she wielded like a weapon. "What's unacceptable, Karen?" Sarah kept her voice level, aware that Rico's crew had stopped working to watch the show. "The noise, the dust, the complete disregard for your neighbors." Karen gestured wildly at the construction site. "You can't just tear up your yard without considering how it affects the rest of us." David stepped forward, his police instincts kicking in. "Karen, we have all the proper permits. The work started at 7:15, which is well within the noise ordinance guidelines." "That's not what I heard," Karen snapped. "They were out here at dawn with jackhammers, waking up the entire street." The lie hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest as she realized the extent of Karen's deception. "Karen," Sarah said carefully, "the crew didn't arrive until 7 o'clock. We have the invoice timestamps to prove it." "I know what I heard." Karen's voice pitched higher, the way it always did when she was caught in a corner. "And I'm not the only one. Mrs. Henderson called me this morning, completely beside herself about the noise." Sarah glanced toward the Henderson house, where she could see the elderly woman tending to her flower garden with obvious unconcern. Either Mrs. Henderson was the world's most dedicated gardener in the face of traumatic noise, or Karen was spinning. Another fabrication. "You know what, Karen?" Sarah's patience finally snapped. "I'm tired of this. Every time we do anything, and I mean anything, to improve our property, you find something to complain about. The sprinklers, the fence stain, the delivery trucks, and now this." "I have every right to protect my property values," Karen shot back. "Your constant construction projects are turning this neighborhood into a work zone." Constant construction. David's voice carried the dangerous quiet of someone reaching their limit. "We restained our fence 2 years ago and fixed our sprinkler system last spring. That's hardly constant." Rico cleared his throat diplomatically. "Folks, we've got a job to finish here. With respect, we'd like to get back to work." Karen whirled on him. "And who are you exactly? Are you properly licensed? Are you insured? Because if one piece of debris lands on my property, I'm holding you persona. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that made everything seem sharper, more defined. Sarah stood at her kitchen window, watching the fill-dirt truck navigate the narrow street toward her backyard. The empty space where the pool had been looked alien now, like a missing tooth in an otherwise familiar smile. David emerged from his home office, phone pressed to his ear, his expression more animated than Sarah had seen in months. Retirement had been good to him, but she could see the old investigative fire burning in his eyes again. "Yeah, I understand the protocol, Janet," he was saying to Officer Torres. "But 17 complaints from one address about multiple neighbors? That's not a coincidence, that's a pattern." Sarah poured herself coffee and tried to look casual, but her stomach was churning with anticipation. She'd barely slept, her mind racing through years of Karen's complaints, reframing every incident in light of David's revelation. "What do you mean the timestamps don't match?" David's voice sharpened. "How far off are we talking?" The fill-dirt truck rumbled past the window, followed immediately by a smaller pickup that Sarah didn't recognize. Through the front blinds, she watched a man in a suit climb out of the truck and walk purposefully toward Karen's house. "David," she interrupted, pointing toward the window. "Someone's visiting Karen." David held up a finger, still listening intently to Torres. "Okay. That's very interesting. Yes, we'll be here all morning." "What? Are you serious?" "No, that changes everything. We'll see you in an hour." He hung up and turned to Sarah with an expression that mixed satisfaction with genuine amazement. "The timestamps on Karen's complaint calls don't match the reported incidents," he said. "When she called about our dawn construction noise, our phone records show she made the call at 6:47 a.m. But the demolition crew's GPS logs prove they didn't even leave their depot until 6:52. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She called to complain about noise that hadn't happened yet. It gets better. Torres ran a deeper check on all 17 complaints. Karen's been filing reports about incidents before they actually occur, sometimes hours before. She's not just lying about what happened, she's predicting what she thinks will happen and then reporting it as fact. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. She's been planning these complaints. Premeditated harassment. That's exactly what it is. And Torres says there's more. That man who just went to Karen's house? That's Detective Morrison from Internal Affairs. Turns out someone else has been keeping track of Karen's complaints too. Before Sarah could process this information, her doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw Martinez and Torres standing on her porch, but their expressions were different now, more serious, more official. "Morning, folks," Torres said when Sarah opened the door. "We need to talk about Karen Whitmore's complaint patterns. What we've discovered goes way beyond simple neighbor disputes." They settled in the living room, Torres pulling out a thick file folder while Martinez set up a digital recorder. The formality of the setup made Sarah's chest tight with anxiety. "Mrs. Chen, we need to ask you some specific questions about your interactions with Mrs. Whitmore over the past year," Torres began. "We are building a case for filing false police reports, but we suspect there might be additional charges." David leaned forward. "Additional charges?" "Harassment, filing fraudulent complaints with city agencies, possibly interfering with legitimate business activities," Martinez listed. "Your neighbor has been very busy." Torres opened her file and pulled out a timeline printed on multiple sheets of paper. "Mrs. Chen, I want you to look at this and tell me if the dates match your recollection of events." Sarah studied the document, her amazement growing with each entry. The timeline stretched back 18 months and included dozens of incidents she'd forgotten or dismissed as minor annoyances. "March 15th, complaint about excessive dog barking at 2 a.m., Sarah read aloud. "We don't have a dog." "March 18th, noise complaint about power tools at 11 p.m., she continued. "David was in Phoenix that week visiting his sister. I was home alone watching Netflix." Torres nodded grimly. "Keep going." April 2nd, complaint about illegal burning in backyard. "We've never had a fire pit." April 10th, report of suspicious vehicles in driveway. Sarah's voice trailed off as she reached the bottom of the first page. "There are 23 complaints here, and at least half of them describe things that never happened." "That's just page 1, Martina said quietly. There are 4 more pages. Sarah felt dizzy. The scope of Karen's deception was staggering. This wasn't just petty neighbor harassment. It was systematic, calculated, and extensive enough to constitute a serious crime. But why? Sarah asked. What could she possibly gain from all this? Torres and Martinez exchanged a look that suggested they'd been asking themselves the same question. We think she's been trying to drive down property values in the neighborhood. Torres said carefully, create enough complaints and incidents to make the area look undesirable. David's eyes narrowed. To what end? We are not sure yet, but Detective Morrison is investigating whether Mrs. Whitmore has financial connections to any local real estate development companies. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Sarah thought about Karen's constant complaints about property values, her obsession with neighborhood quality, her position on the HOA board. She's been trying to destabilize the entire neighborhood, Sarah said slowly. Make everyone so miserable that they'd want to sell. Before anyone could respond, shouting erupted from outside. Through the front window, they could see Karen on her porch, gesticulating wildly at Detective Morrison while a uniformed officer stood nearby. I think that conversation isn't going well, Martinez observed. Morrison appeared unperturbed by Karen's theatrics, his posture radiating the patient authority of someone who dealt with many hostile subjects. But Karen was escalating, her voice rising to a pitch that carried clearly across the street. This is harassment. Karen shrieked. I'm a respected member of this community. I serve on the Homeowners Association board. You can't just show up at my house making wild accusations. Morrison said something too quiet to hear, and Karen's response was explosive. False reports. I've never filed a false report in my life. Everything I've reported has been legitimate neighborhood concerns. Sarah, David, and the 2 officers watched from the window as the drama unfolded. Other neighbors had begun to emerge from their houses, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Henderson stood on her porch looking bewildered, while Mr. Peterson openly watched from his driveway. You want to know what I think happened? David said quietly. I think Karen convinced herself that her lies were true. She's been living in her own version of reality for so long that she genuinely believes the stories she's been telling. Torres nodded. We see that sometimes. Pathological complainers who cross the line into actual delusion. They start believing their own fabrications. The situation outside was escalating. Karen had stepped off her porch and was now pointing accusingly at houses throughout the neighborhood, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. The Chens are constantly violating noise ordinances. The Johnsons leave their garbage cans out for days. The Petersons have code violations all over their yard. I'm the only one who cares about maintaining standards. Morrison gestured toward his car, clearly trying to move the conversation away from the increasingly public spectacle. But Karen wasn't finished. You want to know what's really happening? Here, she continued, her voice now reaching a fever pitch. This is a conspiracy. They're all working together to drive me out because I refuse to let this neighborhood go to hell. Sarah felt a chill as she watched Karen's complete break from reality play out in real time. The woman wasn't just lying anymore, she'd constructed an entire alternate universe where she was the victim and everyone else was the villain. We should probably go out there, Torres said, but Morrison was already handling the situation with professional calm. They watched as Morrison said something that seemed to deflate Karen's rage. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time, she looked genuinely confused rather than angry. Mrs. Whitmore, Morrison's voice carried clearly now, we have documentation of 43 separate complaints you filed against your neighbors in the past 18 months. We also have evidence that many of these complaints describe incidents that never occurred or were reported before they allegedly happened. Karen's response was barely audible, but her body language suggested complete denial. Furthermore, Morrison continued, we have reason to believe you've been filing similar complaints with the City Planning Department, the Health Department, and the Fire Marshal's Office. Filing false reports with any of these agencies constitutes a separate criminal offense. The fight seemed to go out of Karen all at once. She stood in her driveway looking suddenly smaller, older, and utterly bewildered by the world crashing down around her. Torres's radio crackled to life. Detective Morrison requesting backup for transport, came the tinny voice. One adult female, voluntary compliance expected. Sarah's heart hammered as she realized what was happening. Karen was being arrested. "They're taking her in," Martinez said unnecessarily. Through the window, they watched Morrison guide Karen toward his car with surprising gentleness. The revelation hit Sarah like ice water. She gripped the doorframe as Martinez's words sank in, her mind reeling with the implications. Similar charges. David's voice carried the sharp edge of his old interrogation training. "What exactly are we talking about here?" Martinez shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the neighborhood as if Karen might materialize from the shadows. "Can we talk inside? This gets complicated." They settled back into the living room, the same seats they'd occupied that morning when their biggest concern had been false noise complaints. Now, as evening shadows stretched across the hardwood floors, Sarah felt like she was living in someone else's nightmare. "The Riverside Police Department contacted us after they saw Karen's arrest report hit the system," Martinez began. "Detective Linda Walsh has been tracking a case there for the past 3 years. Systematic harassment, false reports, fraudulent complaints to city agencies. The whole pattern." Sarah's throat felt dry. 3 years. It gets worse. Walsh says they never got enough evidence to prosecute before Karen moved away. The complaint stopped, the case went cold, and they assumed she'd either reformed or become someone else's problem. David leaned forward, his investigative instincts fully engaged. "What kind of timeline are we looking at? When did she move from Riverside to here?" Martinez consulted his notes. "Karen Whitmore purchased the house next door to you in March 2019. The complaints in Riverside stopped in February 2019. She literally packed up her harassment campaign and moved it here." The timing made Sarah nauseous. Karen hadn't just chosen their neighborhood randomly. She'd fled prosecution in Riverside and immediately begun the same pattern of behavior here. "How many victims in Riverside?" David asked. 17 households. Walsh estimates over 200 false reports filed across multiple agencies over a 30-month period. Sarah did the math in her head and felt dizzy. Combined with the Oakwood Hills complaints, Karen had been filing false reports for nearly 5 years. This wasn't a mental health crisis or a personality conflict. It was a predatory pattern of behavior. "There's more," Martinez continued reluctantly. "Walsh thinks Riverside wasn't Karen's first location either. She's been tracking similar complaint patterns in databases across 3 counties. The MO is always the same: move into an established neighborhood, target specific families, file systematic false reports until either the victims move away or law enforcement gets too close." "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "She's been doing this 4 years. How many neighborhoods? How many families?" "We don't know yet. Walsh is coordinating with departments in Fairfield, San Marco, and Riverside to compare case files. But based on preliminary data, we are looking at potentially dozens of victim families across multiple jurisdictions." David stood up and began pacing, a habit from his police days when he was processing complex cases. "This changes everything. We are not dealing with a troubled neighbor. We are looking at someone who's made a career out of terrorizing people." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it automatically, then felt her blood turn to slush. The message was, "From an unknown number. I know you think you've won, but this is far from over. Some of us don't give up so easily." Her hand shook as she showed the message to David and Martinez. The officer's expression darkened as he read the screen. "When did this come in?" he demanded. "Just now. 8:47 p.m. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Martinez was already on his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 23. I need an immediate welfare. Check on Karen Whitmore, current location unknown. Possible violation of release conditions." The dispatcher's response crackled through the radio. "Unit 23, suspect Whitmore was released on her own recognizance at 4:30 p.m. No current location available." Sarah felt the world tilt. She's out. Already. "First offense in this jurisdiction," Martinez explained grimly. "Judge sets standard bail conditions. Stay away from complainants, no contact orders. But if she's already violating those conditions..." David took the phone from Sarah's trembling hands. "We need to document this immediately. Screenshot, call, logs, everything." As David worked with the phone, Sarah tried to process the cascade of revelations. Karen wasn't just a troubled neighbor. She was a serial harasser who had systematically destroyed the peace of multiple communities. And now she was free, angry, and apparently far from finished. Martinez's radio crackled again. All units, be advised. We have reports of suspicious activity at 1247 Oakwood Drive. Caller reports someone in dark clothing examining vehicles in driveways. Sarah's heart stopped. 1247 Oakwood Drive was 3 houses down from them. That's our street. She whispered. Martinez was already moving toward the door. I want both of you to stay inside, keep the doors locked, and call 911 if you see anything suspicious. Don't try to handle this yourselves. Through the front window, Sarah watched Martinez's patrol car speed down their street toward the reported disturbance. The normally quiet neighborhood suddenly felt menacing, every shadow potentially hiding Karen's twisted revenge. David double-checked all the door locks and closed the blinds. I'm calling Torres, he said. This has escalated beyond a simple harassment case. While David made the call, Sarah found herself replaying every interaction she'd had with Karen. Over the past 2 years, the woman's intense stares, her detailed knowledge of everyone's schedules, her uncanny ability to file complaints about incidents that hadn't happened yet, it all made horrifying sense now. Torres is sending additional patrols, David reported. They're also expediting the warrant for Karen's financial records. If she's been doing this across multiple jurisdictions, there has to be a financial motive. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Check your backyard. This time, Sarah didn't hesitate. She thrust the phone at David and ran to the kitchen window. The newly filled area where the pool had been was clearly visible under the security light, but something was wrong. David, she called, her voice tight with fear. There's something out there. He joined her at the window, and they both saw it immediately. Someone had spray-painted a message across the fresh dirt in large, angry letters. This isn't over. David was on the phone with 911 before Sarah could fully process what she was seeing. The violation felt deeply personal, as if Karen had reached directly into their home and left her mark on their most private space. Officers are en route, David reported. They want us to stay away from the windows and doors until they can. Secure the scene. They retreated to the interior hallway, the safest spot in the house, and waited. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in the silence, punctuated by the distant sound of sirens growing closer. How did we miss this? She asked David. How did we not see that she was this dangerous? Because she's good at it, David replied grimly. She's had years of practice perfecting her technique. The escalation is gradual, the complaints seem reasonable at first, and by the time you realize what's happening, you're already trapped in her web. The sirens were close now, and Sarah could see red and blue lights flashing through the crack under the hallway door. The cavalry was coming, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. Karen had made her point. 20 minutes later, Torres knocked on their door with an update that was both reassuring and terrifying. We found her, Torres announced. Karen was hiding in the Petersons' shed, still wearing dark clothing and carrying a can of spray paint. She's back in custody, but this time the charges are much more serious. Sarah felt relief flood through her, followed immediately by a new wave of anxiety. What kind of charges? Violation of release conditions, criminal trespass, destruction of property, stalking, and criminal threats. The DA is also looking at terrorism charges based on the pattern of intimidation. Terrorism. David's eyebrows shot up. Systematic harassment designed to instill fear in a community, Torres explained. It's a stretch, but given the multi-jurisdictional pattern, they might make it stick. As Torres left to continue the investigation, Sarah and David stood in their kitchen, looking out at the violated dirt where their pool used to be. The spray-painted message was clearly visible, a reminder that their ordeal was far from over. Despite Karen's arrest, "We can't stay here tonight," Sarah said quietly. "I won't be able to sleep knowing she was in our yard." David nodded. "I'll call Emma, see if we can stay with her in Seattle for a few days while this gets sorted out." But before David could make the call, Torres returned with Detective Morrison and a woman Sarah didn't recognize. A tall, athletic blonde in her 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, this is Detective Linda Walsh from Riverside PD," Morrison said. "She's been tracking Karen Whitmore's activities for much longer than we have." Walsh shook their hands with a firm grip and direct eye contact. "I'm sorry you've had to deal with this. When I saw Karen's arrest report, I knew we needed to coordinate our cases immediately." "How long have you been tracking her?" Sarah asked. 4 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Walsh replied with the precision of someone who had lived with this case for too long. "Karen Whitmore has destroyed more lives than you can imagine, and she's gotten away with it because she's smart. Enough to move jurisdictions before we can build a solid case." Walsh opened a thick folder and spread photographs acro. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the Riverside County Federal Courthouse, her hands trembling slightly as she held the folder containing her victim impact statement. The marble hallways echoed with the footsteps of lawyers, defendants, and families, whose lives had been upended by Meridian Holdings' systematic fraud. "You ready for this?" David asked, adjusting his tie with the nervous precision of someone more comfortable in uniform than formal wear. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure she'd ever be ready to face Karen Whitmore again. The woman who had terrorized her neighborhood was sitting somewhere in this building, probably calculating new lies even as federal prosecutors built an ironclad case against her. Detective Walsh approached them, carrying a briefcase that had grown considerably thicker since their first meeting. "The grand jury returned indictments this morning," she announced. "Karen Whitmore is facing 14 federal charges, and Meridian Holdings is looking at corporate dissolution under RICO." "What about the other victims?" Sarah asked. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd been contacted by families from Fairfield, San Marco, Riverside, and 2 other communities. The scope of Meridian's operation had expanded with each new victim who came forward. 47 families across 6 jurisdictions, Walsh replied. The FBI estimates total damages at over $12 million in depressed property values, forced relocations, and emotional distress. This is going to be one of the largest real estate fraud prosecutions in California history. Through the courthouse windows, Sarah could see news vans lined up along the street. The Meridian Holdings case had captured national attention as a symbol of corporate predation on residential communities. CNN was calling it the neighbor from hell conspiracy, while the Wall Street Journal had run a 3-part series on systematic harassment as a business model. Mrs. Chen, a young woman in a sharp business suit, approached them. "I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Park. Thank you for being here today." Park looked like she could have been Emma's age, but her demeanor carried the focused intensity of someone who'd built her career prosecuting complex financial crimes. Sarah felt a surge of confidence knowing that Karen would be facing this formidable opponent in court. "How strong is the case?" David asked. "Overwhelming," Park replied without hesitation. "We have Karen's financial records, recorded phone calls with her Meridian handlers, documented patterns across multiple jurisdictions, and testimony from 47 victim families. She's going to prison for a very long time." They were interrupted by a commotion near the courthouse entrance. Through the glass doors, Sarah could see protesters gathering, but these weren't supporters of Karen or Meridian. They were victims, and community advocates holding signs reading "Justice for Neighborhood Terrorism" and "Corporate Harassment is Crime." "The community response has been incredible," Park observed. "We've received over 300 letters of support for the prosecution, and the media coverage has prompted similar investigations in 12 other states." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions as she watched the growing crowd outside. Her personal nightmare had become a national case study, her private suffering transformed into a symbol of corporate overreach. It was validating but also overwhelming. "There's something else you should know," Park continued. "Karen Whitmore wants to make a statement before sentencing. She's requesting to address you and the other victims directly." David's expression darkened. "Is that normal?" "It's unusual, but not unprecedented. The court has discretionary authority to allow victim-offender dialogue in cases where it might serve the interests of justice." Sarah felt her stomach clench. The thought of hearing Karen's voice again, of looking into those calculating eyes, made her physically nauseous. But there was also a part of her that wanted answers, wanted to understand how someone could systematically destroy lives for money. "What would that involve?" she asked. "A supervised session with all the primary victims present. Karen would make her statement, and you'd have the opportunity to respond if you choose. It's entirely voluntary, and you can refuse without any impact on the case." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Emma, watching the news coverage from Seattle. So proud of you both for fighting back. Love you. The message reminded Sarah that this case extended far beyond her personal experience. Her daughter, her neighbors, her community, they were all watching to see whether justice would prevail over systematic intimidation. I'll do it, Sarah said firmly. I want to hear what she has to say. 2 hours later, Sarah found herself in a sterile conference room deep within the courthouse, sitting across a metal table from Karen Whitmore. The woman looked dramatically different from the polished HOA president who had once terrorized Oakwood Hills. Orange jumpsuit, no makeup, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, she looked smaller, older, and utterly defeated. The other primary victims had also chosen to attend. The Martinez family from Fairfield, whose autistic son had been traumatized by Karen's false reports about suspicious behavior. The elderly Johnsons from San Marco, who'd lost their retirement home when property values plummeted. The young Chen family from Riverside, no relation to Sarah, whose newborn daughter had been subjected to false reports about excessive crying. Federal marshals stood at attention near the doors, while Park and the defense attorney flanked their respective clients. The atmosphere was tense with years of accumulated pain and rage. Karen looked up from her hands for the first time since they'd entered the room. Her eyes met Sarah's across the table, and for a moment, Sarah saw something she hadn't expected: genuine remorse. I want to start by saying that I'm sorry, Karen began, her voice barely above a whisper. I know that doesn't mean anything now, but I need you all to know that I never intended for it to go this far. Mrs. Martinez made a sound of disgust. You destroyed our family for money. You filed reports claiming our son was dangerous because he stimmed in his own backyard. How do you not intend something like that? Karen flinched as if she'd been struck. I was told the reports were just paperwork, that they wouldn't really hurt anyone. Meridian said they were creating temporary inconvenience to facilitate urban renewal. Urban renewal. David's voice was ice cold. You mean gentrification. You mean driving out established families so developers could profit. I was in debt, Karen continued, tears starting to flow. My ex-husband left me with nothing. I was facing foreclosure, and Meridian offered me a way out. They said I'd be helping communities transition to higher property values, that everyone would benefit in the long run. Sarah listened to Karen's explanation with growing amazement. Even now, faced with federal charges and a room full of victims, the woman was still trying to rationalize her actions as somehow beneficial. How much did they pay you? Asked Mr. Johnson, the elderly man from San Marco whose wife had died of stress-related complications during their forced relocation. Karen's voice dropped even lower. $1,500 a month base salary, plus bonuses for successful relocations. I made almost $80,000 last year. The number hung in the air like poison. $80,000, more than many of the families in the room made in honest work, earned by systematically destroying their lives. My wife is dead because of you, Mr. Johnson said with quiet fury. She had a heart attack 3 days before we were supposed to move. 80 years old, and she died thinking we'd failed to maintain our home properly because of your lies. Karen broke down completely at that, sobbing into her hands while the marshals shifted uncomfortably. Sarah found herself studying the woman's grief, trying to determine if it was genuine or another performance. Why us? Sarah asked when Karen's sobs subsided. Why our neighborhood specifically? Karen wiped her eyes and looked directly at Sarah. For the first time, Meridian identified Oakwood Hills as a target because the properties were undervalued relative to the surrounding area. Good bones, established infrastructure, but aging demographics and deferred maintenance. You were supposed to be easy targets. Easy targets, David repeated flatly. Families with limited resources to fight back, older residents who might welcome an excuse to downsize, young couples who could be convinced to upgrade. Karen's voice trailed off as she seemed to realize how coldly calculating her words sounded. Mrs. Martinez leaned forward. What about our son? What about the reports claiming he was violent and dangerous? How was that supposed to help anyone? Karen's explanation was devastating in its banality. Meridian's research showed that families with special needs children were more likely to relocate when faced with community pressure. They said the reports would just create enough social discomfort to encourage voluntary departure. The casual cruelty of it, the reduction of a vulnerable child to a strategic pressure point, left the room in stunned silence. You realize. Park interjected that those false reports about a minor with disabilities constitute federal hate crime enhancements, carrying mandatory minimum sentences. Karen nodded miserably. My lawyer explained that. I understand I'm probably going to prison for the rest of my life. Good, said Mrs. Chen from Riverside. You should have thought about that before you made my maternity leave a living hell, with false reports about child endangerment. The session continued. 6 months later, Sarah knelt in the rich soil where her pool had once stood, her hands deep in earth that had been transformed from concrete wasteland to fertile garden bed. The space bloomed with native California plants chosen specifically for their resilience: lavender, sage, poppies, and a climbing jasmine that would eventually cover the trellis David had built along the back fence. Mom, this is incredible, Emma said, photographing the garden with the enthusiasm of someone documenting a miracle. She'd moved back to California 3 months ago, partly to help her parents recover from their ordeal, but mostly because the tech company where she worked had embraced remote employment. Sarah sat back on her heels, surveying the transformation. Where Karen's spray-painted threat had once marred the dirt, a small fountain now bubbled peacefully, surrounded by stones that neighbors had contributed from their own gardens. Each stone carried a small inscription, messages of support, gratitude, and hope. The sentencing hearing was this morning, David announced, emerging from the house with his phone and a grim expression of satisfaction. Karen got 18 years federal, no possibility of parole for 12. Thomas Meridian got 25 to life under RICO. Emma looked up from her photography. What about the other Meridian employees? Sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement. The company itself is being dissolved, with all assets going to victim compensation. David settled onto the garden bench they'd installed where the pool's diving board used to be. Detective Walsh says it's the most comprehensive prosecution of systematic harassment in California history. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions at the news. Justice had been served, but 18 years seemed both too much and too little for the woman who had systematically destroyed so many lives. She thought about Mr. Johnson, whose wife would never see this resolution, and the Martinez boy, who still flinched when police cars drove past their house. Any word from the other neighborhoods? Sarah asked. Fairfield is planning a community garden project modeled after ours, David replied. San Marco voted to establish a victims advocacy program. Riverside. Well, Riverside is suing everyone. In sight, but that's probably therapeutic in its own way. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of media attention, legal proceedings, and unexpected community building. Sarah had testified before a congressional subcommittee on corporate fraud, been featured on 60 Minutes, and received thousands of letters from people who'd experienced similar harassment in their own neighborhoods. The strangest part had been the recognition. She'd been named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the category of advocates for justice. The accompanying profile called her the suburban mother who exposed a nationwide conspiracy, which made her sound far more heroic than she felt. Speaking of recognition, Emma said with barely contained excitement, I have news. Remember that documentary crew that interviewed you last month? Sarah nodded. The filmmakers had been following the Meridian case as part of a larger project about corporate crime in residential communities. They just got picked up by Netflix, Emma announced. The documentary is going to be called The Neighbor Conspiracy. And it premieres next month. They want you to attend the Los Angeles screening. Sarah's first instinct was to decline. She'd had enough of being a public figure, enough of having her personal trauma dissected for public consumption. But then she thought about the families still fighting similar battles in communities across the country. Will it help other victims? She asked. The filmmakers think it could lead to federal legislation requiring disclosure of harassment for hire schemes, Emma replied. Senators Warren and Feinstein are already drafting bills based on your case. David smiled at his wife's expression. You know you're going to say yes. Sarah laughed, realizing he was right. The woman who had once avoided confrontation at all costs had somehow become someone who couldn't walk away from a fight that might help others. A knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Sarah could see Martinez and Torres standing on the porch, but they were both out of uniform and carrying what looked like a gift. Afternoon, folks, Martinez said when Sarah opened the door. We were in the neighborhood and wanted to see the famous garden. Torres handed Sarah a wrapped package. This is from the entire department. We thought you might like it. Inside the wrapping was a beautiful ceramic plaque reading, "In a garden, growth requires both pulling weeds and planting seeds. Thank you for doing both. Riverside County Sheriff's Department." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. The simple gesture meant more than all the media attention and congressional hearings combined. "There's something else," Torres said. "The department is implementing new protocols for handling harassment complaints based on what we learned from your case. We are calling them the Whitmore Protocols: systematic tracking of complaint patterns, mandatory verification procedures, and interjurisdictional cooperation. Other departments are adopting similar measures," Martinez added. "Your case is literally rewriting how law enforcement handles neighbor disputes." After the officers left, Sarah found herself standing in her garden as the afternoon sun slanted through the jasmine leaves. The space felt sacred somehow, transformed not just from pool to garden, but from a symbol of harassment to a monument of resilience. "You know what's funny?" she said to David and Emma, who had joined her among the flowers. "If Karen had just been a normal bad neighbor, we probably would have moved. But because she pushed so hard, she ended up destroying herself and saving the neighborhood." Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've been thinking about that a lot. How sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the thing that makes you strongest." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what her daughter meant. The harassment had been terrible, the stress had nearly broken her marriage, and the fear had stolen months of sleep. But it had also revealed reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, brought her community together in ways that never would have happened otherwise, and ultimately led to protections for thousands of other families. "Mrs. Chen." A voice called from the front yard. Sarah looked up to see a young woman with a notebook and earnest expression approaching the garden gate. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm a journalism student at UCLA, and I'm writing about communities that have recovered from systematic harassment. Could I ask you a few questions?" Sarah's first instinct was to politely decline, but then she noticed the woman's press credentials. The university was training the next generation of investigative reporters, people who might uncover the next Meridian Holdings before it could destroy more communities. "Of course," Sarah said, gesturing toward the garden bench. "But I want to show you something first." She led the young journalist to the fountain at the center of the garden, where the stones formed a rough circle around the bubbling water. "Each of these stones represents a family that was harassed by the same criminal organization," Sarah explained. 47 families across 6 communities. But look what grew when we stood together instead of suffering alone. The journalist scribbled notes while photographing the fountain, clearly moved by the symbolism of transformation and community. "What would you tell someone who's facing similar harassment right now?" the student asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Document everything, trust your instincts, and remember that you're probably not the only target. Predators rely on isolation. They want you to think you're alone and powerless. But when communities stand together, even the most sophisticated harassment schemes can be defeated." As the interview concluded, Sarah realized that giving advice to other victims had become as important to her recovery as tending her garden. Every article, every documentary, every congressional hearing was like planting seeds that might grow into protection for other families. The sun was setting over Oakwood Hills as the journalist left, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reflected off the fountain surface. Sarah stood among her flowers, breathing in the scent of jasmine and sage, listening to the peaceful bubble of water and the distant laughter of children playing in yards where they felt safe again. "Dinner." David called from the kitchen door. Sarah took one last look at her garden, then headed inside to join her family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, another interview, another legal consultation, another family reaching out for help with their own harassment situation. But tonight, she would simply enjoy the peace she had fought so hard to create. The pool was gone, Karen was in federal prison, and Meridian Holdings had been reduced to a cautionary tale in business school textbooks. But most importantly, the garden grew stronger every day, its roots deep in soil that had been watered with tears and tended with hope. In the space where destruction had once threatened to take hold, life had not just returned, it had flourished beyond anything Sarah could have imagined when she first picked up that sledgehammer 6 months ago. Sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow in the places where the deepest wounds have healed. And in neighborhoods across America, other families facing their own harassment campaigns were reading about Sarah's story, learning that they didn't have to suffer alone, and discover